The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. Jesus addressed this parable to those who were convinced of their own righteousness and despised everyone else. Two men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, the other a publican. The Pharisee took up his position and spoke this prayer to himself: "O God, I thank you that I am not like the rest of humanity, greedy, dishonest, adulterous, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, I pay tithes on my whole income." But the tax collector stood off at a distance and would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and prayed, "O God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, the latter went home justified, but not the former. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord. A lot of things I would like to refer to in the readings, but try to keep it a little limited. First reading, again, as has been the case for the past number of weeks, a great little reflection for us in regard to prayer. The Lord is a God of justice who knows no favorites. Though not unduly partial to the weak, yet he hears the cry of the oppressed. It sounds like a theme that is continuing to come through these past few weeks. And the theme is, we got to be persistent in prayer, right? You remember? Yes? Sure we do. Last week, the widow crying out to the unjust judge, absolutely being persistent in her plea to bring about justice. And we've seen that theme coming up again and again, how important it is to be persistent in prayer. In our study groups, the material is fabulous from that perspective. And how wonderful she didn't start the book with that chapter on prayer. She started off with the ingredients that are very important before we come to prayer. Surrendering your nets, seeing the blessings in life, and then dealing with that thorny question that we all find difficult, loving your enemies. And then moving on to developing an attitude of gratitude, and then she comes to prayer. How great that she didn't start off with prayer, because we would have missed some of those concepts perhaps. Being persistent in prayer is extremely important, and yet it has got to be the most difficult part of prayer, right? Oh, come on, help me out. You think it is the most difficult part of prayer to be persistent? Are you sure? I think it is absolutely the most difficult part of prayer, trying to remain persistent in it. Because I like to subvert God, get ahead of him. I tell him what I need and what he needs to be doing in prayer, a great deal. But I'm not very patient with waiting for his response. But it's a constant mantra throughout the scriptures. Hey, be patient. God is good. He is faithful to his people, and he hears us, not in our time, but in the appropriate time. But my time and our time tends to be the immediate, and so it is difficult. Remember 3 weeks ago we had the prophet Habakkuk. How long, O Lord, how long? I call out to you, you do not listen. And God says, well, maybe I do. Pay attention. Pay attention to your prayer. And it appears like a mantra these past few weeks in the readings. And what a beautiful setup that is for the gospel. The gospel, you've heard it many times, yes? And you understand it? To some extent, yes? And how easily we can hear the gospel and say, hey, what a nice story. And I agree with Jesus 100%. And then move on. But what a shame it would be just to hear the parable from that perspective. What treasures we would miss by exploring the parable. Looking carefully at what Jesus is putting before us and asking ourselves, what is he teaching me through this parable? The Pharisees. A Pharisee comes to the temple to pray, and a publican. Not a Republican, publican. The Pharisees were a lay people who dedicated themselves to trying to keep God's law as perfectly and scrupulously as they possibly could. An interesting people. St. Paul was a Pharisee. Listen to that second reading. I have run the race, I have fought the fight. I'm being poured out like a libation. And none of those stood with me to give testimony, may God be good to them. It's the prayer of a Pharisee. He was telling a lot of truth in it. But a Pharisee, all of his life. He never converted to Christianity as we know him. He became one of the primary leaders of the Christian experience. But God called him. He wasn't one of the original 12. He called him later, after Jesus' life on earth, and he became the apostle to the Gentiles. Many of us have this idea that the Pharisees were bad people. And many might even add, Jesus didn't like the Pharisees. Well, that's untrue. Totally untrue. Jesus, as he journeyed along, had some great Pharisees who were a part of his entourage or his traveling party. The Pharisees were a distinct sect, and they performed spiritual practices oftentimes over and above what the law required. There were 613 precepts in the law, and generally these Pharisees knew the law, not unlike us Catholics. Remember the catechism? Who made the world? The first question. God made the world. Why did God make the world? That we should know, love, and serve him here on earth and be happy with him forever in heaven. And what is the sacrament? A sacrament is a sensible or outward sign instituted by Christ to confer grace. Anything else you want to know? That was our catechism. What in the world did it mean? For our brothers and sisters, the Pharisees, the law, the 613 precepts were extremely important, and they tended to perform practices that went above and beyond the requirements of the law. The prayer we hear in today's gospel would have been a rather typical prayer for any Pharisee of the day. And it was probably true. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes on all that I owe. I do not act badly as many of these others do. And I'm committed to your law. One of the great things among the Pharisees, we love your law, O Lord. Now there was a publican. A publican, in Ireland, a publican is a different thing, so don't confuse it. A publican is somebody who owns an establishment that provides alcoholic beverages and at a price, and provides a climate of hospitality, and a lot of stuff is processed in that place, right or wrong or indifferent, but a lot of stuff is processed there, and it is called a pub. And the owner is a publican. But that is not the kind of individual we're talking about. In Jesus' time, we're talking about a public servant. That was the original term used in the gospel writings. If you look at any of the earlier Bibles, that's what's in there. A publican. A publican was a public servant, a Jewish man who worked for the government. The Roman government ruled the people of Israel at that time. And so it was a contentious experience because the Jews, not surprisingly, hated the occupation of their country. I think every country hates being occupied by somebody else. Our whole history in Ireland is totally embedded in that reality and still is a struggle today. Now, a tax collector, publican, he collected the taxes for Rome, which they required annually from all of their subjects. And so a tax collector was looked upon with great disdain. By many of the people of Israel, he was seen as a traitor to his own people because he was a collaborator with the Romans. He was also seen as a thief. That whole concept hadn't gone away. Some people still think the tax man is a thief, right? So we won't ramble into that. But the tax collector would collect the Roman taxes, and then he would add an additional tax, which was his salary. Quite often, they exacted from the subjects a significant fee so that they could live in comfort and have a good lifestyle. Was it against the law? No, not against the Roman law. As far as Rome was concerned, no problem, so long as they got their taxes. Among the people, it was a very contentious issue. So, if we look at the reality, two men coming into the temple to pray, and Jesus presents us what happened. How do we see that as a lived experience in our own world? It might be something like this. I have a friend who has a fundamental belief that divorce is wrong. It's wrong, period. She says, it's the law, and it's a promise you make. She was of the opinion that when people got divorced, they simply didn't try hard enough or they didn't love enough. But after 28 years of marriage, she had celebrated her 25th anniversary with the renewal of vows and the added party and celebration. And then in her 28th year, she finds herself going through a very difficult, contentious, and painful divorce. She's now divorced and she's experiencing a much more fruitful life. She now has a much greater compassion for the struggles of friends and the difficulties that she says are often so hidden and you have no awareness of them. She likes to say now, you just never know what is happening in the other person's life or what they are going through. Was she wrong to begin with? Maybe. Maybe not. Did she have something valuable to learn? You betcha. I have an additional story. Many years ago, a couple came to me for counseling. It really has happened a number of times in like manner over the years. It turns out during the session of counseling that the husband is refusing to forgive his wife for something she has done. It's not necessarily infidelity. We think that way perhaps. But this is about an issue of being truthful or telling the whole truth or withholding some event or some information. An issue where she hasn't told him the full truth or kept something from him. And so we speak about the importance of spouses forgiving each other on the journey of life and how critical that is, that we've got to learn to forgive. We are at the behest of our God forgiving us, and why would we not be developing the same in important relationships? And so as a way of extending the conversation, I say to him, I'm sure she has had to forgive you for some things you did during the course of your marriage. And there is a silence. And then he says rather proudly, I have never done anything that she would have needed to forgive me for. Pretty strange. Few things can end a conversation so rapidly. Really, what does one say in the face of such a reality? There's not much to say. Over the next number of weeks, we continued to meet. There wasn't any significant change. Rather, he emboldened his perspective by adding some other additional issues to present his rightness. Meanwhile, he tells me, I don't want to get a divorce. You think that is a reality? Does that help you understand the parable? Was God going to commend that man for such righteousness? Our study, small group study, in the book we are following, Walking the Path of the Disciples, how wonderful and powerful that book is, yes? Really, really beautifully ordered and beautifully challenging. And Linda Rooney says in the study, I'm sorry that you all don't have a copy of the book. We ran out of them, but it's really worthwhile. It's really worthwhile having in your hand and to be able to follow along. But as we come up to the chapter for this week, the 6th chapter, she says, as we reflect on step 6, we let go of the nets. First chapter, we let go of the nets of preconceived notions when we're really coming to prayer. She said we let go of the nets of past experiences and current events in order to learn how to judge by kingdom standards. Do I judge by kingdom standards or simply my own petty standards? She says we surrender our quick judgments as we intentionally try to see the good in ourselves and in others. Is that my quest in life? See the good in myself and in others. Isn't this what Jesus showed us as he bypassed the external circumstances of those he met, looking instead into our hearts? He demonstrated what God does when God looks at us. This is what he tried to teach the disciples who walked with him, that God, who is good, is present in all people and all situations. You see that in the gospel? And he is present in all people and all situations if we only have eyes to see. Blessed are those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. It is we who need to see rightly, she says. We can all find what is wrong. Yes? We can all find what is wrong. But can we see the good? What a great fundamental question. Where is the good you see in life, even in the face of some really difficult and abhorrent situations or circumstance? We'll continue the theme next week because the gospel is very much alike. If you want to read ahead, and remember we have the time change next weekend, right? Remember. But the gospel is quite similar, and it contains some of these themes. We will continue that theme next week.